A racist officer's hateful act of pouring coffee on a quiet black woman would soon become his biggest regret. He had absolutely no idea about the remarkable individual she had raised, someone whose influence would turn his world upside down. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Every Wednesday at 8:15 in the morning, Mary Johnson arrived at Sunrise Cafe with the punctuality of a church bell. The ritual had become sacred to her over the past 3 years, ever since her husband's passing. She would settle into the corner table by the east-facing window, where golden morning light spilled across the worn wooden tabletop, warming her hands as she cradled her first cup of coffee. The cafe staff knew her order by heart: black coffee with just a touch of cream, served in the blue ceramic mug with the chipped handle. Mary preferred it that way. There was character in things that had weathered time. At 67, the retired widow found comfort in these small constants, these quiet moments before Atlanta fully awakened. "Morning, Miss Mary," called Delia from behind the counter, her voice harmonizing with the gospel music that hummed softly through the cafe's speakers. "Beautiful day coming up." Mary nodded with a gentle smile, smoothing the collar of her neatly pressed blouse. She opened her small devotional book, savoring the peaceful ambiance. The cafe was her sanctuary, a place where she could exist without explanation or expectation, something rarely afforded to her in the outside world. The bell above the door jingled, and the atmosphere shifted immediately. Officer Robert Smith's uniform announced his presence before his booming voice did. Several patrons stiffened, conversations dimmed. The policeman strutted through the cafe like he owned every inch of it, his utility belt jangling with each deliberate step. Robert scanned the room, his gaze eventually landing on Mary. His expression soured when he spotted her occupying what the staff knew he considered his spot. Though the cafe had no reserved seating, the officer had made it clear on numerous occasions that he expected that particular table to be available for him. Well, he muttered. Loud enough for nearby tables to hear, he approached Mary, towering over her seated form. "Seems someone's confused about the regular order of things in here." Mary looked up, her eyes meeting his without flinching. She'd encountered men like Robert Smith her entire life, men who mistook kindness for weakness, who believed their badge or their skin color entitled them to deference. "Good morning, officer," she replied evenly, her voice carrying the gentle lilt of her Georgia upbringing. She didn't move to gather her things, didn't offer to relocate. Robert's jaw tightened, a vein pulsing at his temple. His hand came to rest on his belt, inches from his holster, a gesture not lost on the watching patrons. The morning sunlight caught his badge, sending sharp reflections dancing across the walls as tension filled the once peaceful cafe. Without warning, Officer Robert Smith leaned over Mary Johnson's table, his shadow falling across her peaceful morning ritual. His fingers, adorned with a heavy gold class ring, deliberately nudged her ceramic mug. The scalding liquid cascaded over the rim, splashing across her carefully pressed beige blouse in an expanding dark stain. "Oops," he said, not bothering to hide his smirk. "Guess you were in my spot after all." The bustling Sunrise Cafe fell into an unnatural silence. The barista behind the counter froze mid-pour. The businessman at the next table lowered his newspaper. Even the gospel music, playing softly through the speakers, seemed to fade away, as if the very atmosphere recognized the gravity of what had just occurred. No one moved to help. No one spoke up. Atlanta had its unwritten rules about confronting men with badges, and everyone in that room knew them by heart, yet not a single gaze dropped away. All eyes remained fixed on the retired widow and the uniformed officer standing over her. Mary didn't cry out, she didn't jump up, she didn't frantically dab at the spreading stain with napkins. Instead, she remained perfectly still, her hands resting calmly on the table before her. The coffee burned against her skin, but her expression never changed. She simply looked up and met Robert's eyes. There was something in that look, not anger, not fear, but something far more potent, a quiet dignity that had weathered storms far greater than this man's petty cruelty. Her gaze held him, unwavering and clear, communicating volumes without a single word spoken. The officer's smirk faltered. He had expected tears, apologies, or frightened submission. What he received instead was the steady gaze of a woman who had seen men like him come and go throughout her lifetime, men who mistook uniforms for character and authority for worth. Robert shifted his weight, suddenly uncomfortable under her scrutiny. The badge on his chest, normally a shield, now felt like a spotlight exposing something he preferred to keep hidden. "You should be more careful," he muttered, his voice lacking its earlier confidence. Mary remained silent, her eyes never leaving his face. The moment stretched between them, taut with unspoken history and significance. Everyone in the cafe could feel it. A line had been crossed that could never be uncrossed, a moment captured in time that would ripple outward in ways none of them could yet imagine. Finally, Robert turned away, unable to bear the weight of her gaze any longer. As he stalked toward the door, Mary Johnson remained seated, her dignity intact despite the coffee staining her clothes. In the shadowy back corner of Sunrise Cafe, 16-year-old Michael Davis sat frozen, his breakfast barely touched. The high school junior had only stopped in for a quick bite before school, but now found himself witness to something that made his stomach knot. Without thinking, he raised his smartphone and began recording. His hands trembled slightly as he captured Officer Robert Smith's deliberate cruelty. The device felt impossibly heavy in his grip, but Michael kept it steady, instinctively understanding that what he was documenting mattered. The teen's heart hammered against his ribs as he zoomed in on Mary's coffee-stained blouse, then panned to capture the officer's smug expression. "This isn't right," he whispered to himself, too quietly for anyone else to hear. Around him, the cafe remained eerily silent. Some patrons stared into their cups, unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. Others watched with thinly veiled discomfort, but no one intervened. The gospel music that usually provided a peaceful backdrop now seemed jarringly inappropriate against the tension filling the room. What Officer Smith couldn't know, what none of the silent witnesses realized, was the identity of the dignified woman whose mourning he had just ruined. Mary Johnson wasn't just any retired widow enjoying her weekly ritual. She was the mother of David Johnson, Atlanta's newly appointed police chief who had taken office just 3 weeks prior. David had risen through the ranks with a sterling reputation and a promise to transform the department. His appointment had made headlines across Georgia with his vow to address long-standing issues of misconduct and build community trust. "The badge is a responsibility, not a shield," he had declared at his swearing-in ceremony, with Mary watching proudly from the front row. Michael continued recording as Mary calmly dabbed at her blouse with a napkin. The teenager had no idea who she was, but something about her composure in the face of such blatant disrespect moved him deeply. His own mother had taught him to stand up for what was right, and though he was too intimidated to confront the officer directly, his finger remained steady on the record button. The young student finally lowered his device only when Robert Smith strutted away, coffee in hand, apparently satisfied with his display of power. Michael looked down at his screen, reviewing what he'd captured. The evidence was clear, undeniable. "I should post this," he thought, his thumb hovering over the share button. He hesitated only briefly before pressing it, unaware that his simple act of witness would soon ignite a reckoning that would shake the entire Atlanta Police Department to its core. By noon, Michael Davis's video had erupted across every social media platform. The teenager's hands had trembled as he uploaded the footage, never expecting it would spread like wildfire. Coffee Cop and Mary Johnson began trending within hours, with thousands of shares and comments expressing outrage at Officer Robert Smith's blatant disrespect toward the elderly black woman. The 9-second clip captured everything: the deliberate tilt of Mary's cup, the coffee splashing across her beige blouse, and most powerfully, her unwavering gaze as she faced her aggressor without flinching. It was her dignity in that moment, her refusal to be diminished, that resonated with viewers across Atlanta and beyond. "This is what we deal with every day," wrote one commenter. "The difference is someone finally caught it on camera." By early afternoon, 3 local news stations had picked up the story. Vans from Channel 5, Atlanta Daily News, and Metro Report crowded the sidewalk outside the Atlanta Police Department headquarters. Reporters clutched microphones in the summer heat, their cameras trained on the building's entrance as if expecting justice to walk out the front door. Inside the department, phones rang incessantly. The switchboard operator, overwhelmed by calls demanding Officer Smith's badge, eventually stopped answering. Email inboxes filled with messages bearing subject lines like "disgraceful conduct" and "accountability now." At Sunrise Cafe, the manager had placed a "closed for the day" sign on the door after curious onlookers began showing up, hoping to sit in what they now called Mary's seat. The owner, a middle-aged man who had witnessed the incident firsthand, gave 3 interviews, expressing his regret at not intervening. "You get used to looking away," he admitted to a reporter, his eyes downcast. "That's the problem, isn't it?" Across town, Mary sat quietly in her modest living room, her phone disconnected from the wall. She had no interest in becoming a symbol or sensation. The elderly woman simply wanted what she had always wanted: the dignity of moving through the world unmolested. Meanwhile, on the steps of City Hall, a spontaneous gathering formed. 20 people at first, then 50, then over 100 stood in silence, many holding paper coffee cups. No chants, no speeches, just the visual reminder of how quickly a community's trust could be spilled and stained. The city's collective sense of betrayal burned bright, ignited by the quiet strength of one woman who had simply wanted to enjoy her morning coffee in peace. What none of the protesters yet knew was that Mary Johnson was not just any victim. She was the mother of the man who now held the power to change everything. Chief David Johnson sat alone in his office, the smartphone still warm in his hand after watching the video that had ignited social media. Once was enough. The image of his mother, Mary Johnson's face showing that quiet dignity, even as coffee soaked through her blouse, burned into his memory. Though her expression remained composed, David could read the pain in her eyes that others might miss. He'd seen that same controlled hurt decades ago when neighborhood kids had taunted him, and Mary had taught him that dignity was sometimes the strongest response. The police chief closed his eyes for a moment, centering himself. The fact that one of his own officers had deliberately humiliated his mother made his blood boil, but David wouldn't let emotion cloud his judgment. This wasn't just personal. It represented everything he'd promised to change when he took command of the Atlanta Police Department. Without explanation, he excused himself from the budget meeting he'd been chairing, leaving confused department heads exchanging glances behind him. His stride was purposeful as he moved through the headquarters, corridors, officers instinctively straightening as he passed. "Get Officer Smith to my office, now," he instructed his assistant, voice level but leaving no room for delay. While waiting, David stared at the framed photo on his desk, Mary at his police academy graduation, beaming with pride. The contrast between that joyful moment and the humiliation she'd endured this morning strengthened his resolve. When Robert Smith entered, the swagger that had been so evident in the video was noticeably diminished. The officer stood at attention, perhaps only now realizing whose mother he had targeted at Sunrise Cafe. "Sir, I can explain," Robert began, but David raised his hand, silencing him. "I've seen the video, Officer Smith." His voice remained professional, betraying none of the fury churning inside him. "What I witnessed was conduct unbecoming an officer of this department." Robert shifted uncomfortably. "With all due respect, Chief, it was just coffee." "It was assault," David interrupted, "against a civilian, and an abuse of the authority this badge represents." He tapped his own chest where the shield rested. "Effective immediately. You're placed on administrative leave. Your weapon and badge, please." The officer's face flushed with anger, but he complied, placing both items on the desk between them. "A full investigation will follow," David continued. "I suggest you secure legal representation." After Robert left, David remained at his desk, contemplating the weight of what had just begun. This wasn't just about his mother anymore. It was about every complaint that had been ignored, every abuse that had been covered up. Mary Johnson had raised him to stand for something, and now the time had come to prove it. David Johnson stared at the video playing on his computer screen for the 5th time. The image of his mother's coffee-stained blouse burned into his consciousness, but it was her eyes, steady, dignified, unbroken, that truly haunted him. He closed the laptop with a decisive click. For Atlanta's police chief, this wasn't merely about disciplining Robert Smith. The incident at Sunrise Cafe had ripped open wounds that had festered beneath the department's polished surface for years, a legacy of complaints systematically ignored and abuses methodically buried. "This ends now," he whispered to the empty office. David pulled a thick folder from his desk drawer, a collection of civilian complaints he'd been quietly reviewing since taking office 3 months ago. Each page told a similar story: officers abusing power, reports vanishing, victims silenced. The pattern was unmistakable and sickening. His phone buzzed with a message from Mayor Linda Williams. "Press conference in 2 hours. What's your plan?" The chief rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of his position. His mother had raised him to believe that true leadership meant making difficult choices, especially when they weren't popular. Now, her suffering would become the catalyst for the change he'd always intended to implement. He began drafting his statement, knowing it would send shockwaves through the department. A comprehensive review of all misconduct allegations from the past 5 years, mandatory retraining, independent oversight, transparency protocols that couldn't be circumvented. "They'll fight you on this," warned his deputy, poking her head through the doorway. "The union's already making noise." "Let them," David replied, not looking up from his notes. "We're not just addressing one incident, we're addressing a culture." He thought about Alicia Carter's case, buried 2 years ago when she was just a teenager, and dozens of others like it. How many victims had walked away believing justice was impossible? How many officers like Robert had been emboldened by silence? As he prepared to face the cameras, David straightened his tie and thought of Mary Johnson sitting alone in her modest home, probably downplaying her experience to avoid worrying him. His mother had always carried her dignity like armor, never seeking the spotlight even when wronged. "Your suffering won't be in vain, Mom," he promised silently. Outside his window, news vans were already gathering. Social media was ablaze with hashtags and outrage. The city was watching, waiting to see if this would be just another hollow promise or something truly transformative. David Johnson squared his shoulders and walked toward the press room, carrying both the burden of his mother's humiliation and the opportunity it presented. The department would change, not because one officer had been cruel, but because that cruelty had finally found a witness the world couldn't ignore. Dawn broke over Atlanta with a strange, electric tension in the air. What began as a handful of people clutching coffee cups outside the Atlanta Police Department headquarters quickly swelled into something extraordinary. By 8 in the morning, students from nearby colleges arrived in groups, their backpacks slung over shoulders, each carrying a simple cup of coffee. Mothers pushed strollers with one hand while balancing their drinks in the other. Elderly church elders stood tall despite aching joints, their weathered hands wrapped around warm cups. No one spoke, no chants echoed through the streets, no signs demanded justice, just coffee, the silent symbol of Mary Johnson's dignity in the face of cruelty. A young seminary student named Rachel placed her cup on the ground and lit a small candle beside it. Others followed suit until a flickering garden of light surrounded the building's perimeter. The morning news crews arrived, cameras capturing the growing crowd that communicated volumes without uttering a single word. By 9:30, Over 100 Atlantans stood shoulder to shoulder in the morning light. Business professionals in suits stood next to construction workers in hard hats. Teachers who had called in substitutes clasped hands with grocery store clerks who had switched shifts. The diversity of faces reflected Atlanta itself, a tapestry of humanity united by a shared sense of injustice. Jasmine Brown arrived with her parents, clutching the same smartphone she had used to record the incident at Sunrise Cafe. The teenager moved through the crowd quietly, documenting this new chapter of the story she had helped bring to light. When an elderly man asked why she kept filming, she whispered, "So no one can say it didn't happen." Inside headquarters, officers peered through windows, some with confusion, others with shame. The wall of silent citizens created a mirror that reflected uncomfortable truths back at the department. A few officers quietly removed their badges and joined the crowd, standing in plain clothes among their community. What made the protest so powerful was precisely what had made Mary's response so devastating: the absence of noise, the refusal to escalate, the dignified insistence on being seen. The crowd embodied her unspoken power, amplifying it across the city square. By noon, news helicopters circled overhead, broadcasting aerial shots of the growing assembly. The message was unmistakable. Atlanta would no longer look away. The silence that had protected Officer Robert Smith and others like him for years had been transformed into a different kind of silence altogether, one that demanded accountability rather than concealing wrongdoing. This wordless demonstration spoke volumes, and not a single person in power could pretend not to hear it. As David Johnson stood at his office window, the morning sun illuminated the growing crowd below. Hundreds of Atlanta residents stood in silent protest, each holding a coffee cup, a powerful symbol of solidarity with his mother. The police chief's heart swelled with conflicting emotions, pride in the community's response, yes, but also a deep sense of dread about the battle ahead. "They're standing with her," he whispered to himself, pressing his palm against the cool glass. The quiet dignity of the protesters mirrored Mary's own response to her humiliation. David knew these people weren't just supporting his mother, they were demanding accountability from an institution they no longer trusted. His phone buzzed with updates about the protest's growing numbers. Church groups, students from local universities, and families with children had joined the initial gathering. Their silence spoke volumes, creating a tension that no shouting could match. By mid-afternoon, David had returned to his desk, sorting through the mountain of paperwork that came with his position. His email notification chimed. An anonymous message had arrived with several attachments. The subject line read simply, "What Officer Smith has been hiding." His fingers hesitated over the mouse. David had suspected Robert's behavior at the cafe wasn't an isolated incident, but nothing prepared him for what he found in those files. Complaint after complaint against the officer, spanning 8 years, all systematically buried or dismissed by the department. A black teenager handcuffed for looking suspicious while waiting for a bus. An elderly man roughed up during a routine traffic stop. A young woman threatened when she attempted to file a harassment report. The pattern was unmistakable, and the department's response equally consistent: internal protection, external denial. "Jesus," David muttered, scrolling through the documents. Each case had been marked insufficient evidence or officer's account verified, bureaucratic language that masked a culture of complicity. He printed the files, spreading them across his desk. The faces of Robert's victims stared back at him, people who had sought justice and found none. Among them, David recognized Alicia Carter, whose case had briefly made headlines 3 years earlier before vanishing from public attention. The chief leaned back in his chair, the weight of responsibility settling heavily on his shoulders. This wasn't just about his mother anymore. The coffee incident had merely pulled back the curtain on years of systematic abuse. David reached for his phone and called his assistant. "Get me internal affairs. All of them, now." His voice was steady, but carried an unmistakable edge of determination. and find out who has access to our complaint archives. The battle for justice wasn't just beginning, it was about to become a war. David Johnson stared at the screen, his fingers trembling slightly as he scrolled through page after page of damning evidence. The anonymous email had opened a Pandora's box of corruption that stretched far beyond Officer Robert Smith's coffee incident. With each complaint he read, each story of intimidation, excessive force, and abuse of power, the knot in his stomach tightened. "This goes back years," he whispered to himself, rubbing his temples. The police chief reached for his phone and dialed Internal Affairs. "I need your team in my office now." Within the hour, 5 investigators crowded around his conference table as David laid out what he'd discovered. Every complaint against Smith was buried, every witness intimidated, every victim discredited. He pushed a stack of folders across the table. "And he's not alone." The lead investigator, a veteran with 23 years on the force, paled as she flipped through the documents. "Chief, if this is accurate, we're talking about systemic corruption across multiple precincts." "That's exactly what we're talking about," David replied, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "And it stops today." For the next 72 hours, the Internal Affairs team worked without pause, pulling files, cross-referencing testimonies, and building a comprehensive picture of the department's failures. They uncovered falsified reports where officers had covered for each other, evidence that had mysteriously disappeared from lockup, and dozens of excessive force complaints that had been dismissed without investigation. David thought of his mother, Mary Johnson, sitting dignified and silent as coffee soaked through her blouse. How many others had suffered similar indignities, or worse, with no camera to record it, no viral video to demand justice? One case particularly haunted him, a young man beaten during a routine traffic stop whose complaint had been dismissed as unsubstantiated, despite hospital records documenting his injuries. The officer responsible had been promoted twice since the incident. "The culture runs deep," the lead investigator told David as they reviewed their findings. "Officers are taught from day one, protect your own no matter what." David nodded grimly. "And those who speak up, transferred, demoted, or forced out," she confirmed. "We found 8 officers in the last 5 years who tried to report misconduct. Not one is still with the department." Looking out his office window at the Atlanta skyline, the chief felt the weight of his position like never before. The department's dirty laundry was now impossible to hide, and the stain stretched back a decade. "Prepare the full report," he instructed. "Every name, every incident, every cover-up. It's time Atlanta knows the truth." The Atlanta Police Department's headquarters buzzed with tension as David Johnson sat at his desk, reviewing the latest batch of complaints against his officers. 3 resignation letters had arrived that morning, each one citing betrayal of brotherhood as the reason for departure. David wasn't surprised. He'd expected resistance when he began digging into the department's darkest corners. Captain Reynolds, a 20-year veteran, stopped by his office without knocking. "You're tearing this place apart, Johnson," he said, dropping his badge on the desk. "Some things are better left alone." David didn't flinch. "Is that what you told yourself when those complaints against Robert Smith kept disappearing?" The Atlanta Police Union wasn't staying quiet either. Their representative, a stern-faced woman named Patricia Wilkins, had scheduled a press conference for that afternoon. David watched it from his office as she declared his reforms a politically motivated witch hunt designed to undermine the brave men and women who protect this city. The union threatened legal action, budget freezes, and even a possible work slowdown. Several city council members had already called, urging David to find a middle ground and consider the bigger picture. But the police chief thought of his mother's quiet dignity that morning at Sunrise Cafe, how she'd sat there with coffee soaking her blouse, refusing to be diminished. He remembered the files that had appeared in his inbox, years of complaints buried by the very system he now commanded. "Sir," his assistant interrupted. "To the mayor's on line 1. Linda Williams didn't waste time with pleasantries. "They're coming for you hard, David. The union's got half the council ready to pull your funding." "And where do you stand?" he asked. "I've got your back," the mayor replied. "But this won't be pretty." That evening, David called a department-wide meeting. Officers filled the briefing room, their faces a mix of hostility, fear, and, from a few, cautious support. "Mdres, I've heard I'm destroying morale," David began, his voice steady, "that I'm betraying the family. But morale built on silence isn't morale, it's complicity." The room grew still as he continued. "Every officer who abuses power, and every colleague who looks away, they're the ones betraying what this badge means." His words earned him both admiration and scorn. Some officers nodded in agreement, while others stared daggers at him. By the time he finished speaking, the battle lines were clearly drawn. As David walked back to his office, his phone buzzed with a text from his mother. "Stand firm," and he intended to do exactly that. The list appeared overnight, printed on department letterhead and taped to the glass doors of the Atlanta Police Department. By sunrise, officers arriving for the morning shift clustered around it, murmuring in disbelief. Chief David Johnson had posted the names of 7 officers, including Robert Smith, under formal investigation for misconduct and abuse of power. "He's lost his mind," muttered one sergeant, quickly photographing the notice with his smartphone before hurrying inside. By midday, the bold move had divided the city. Outside police headquarters, supporters gathered with handmade signs praising the chief's transparency. Local news crews captured the scene as passing cars honked in solidarity. On social media, "Dasa Cleanup APD" began trending alongside images of the notice. What Chief Johnson did wasn't just brave, it was necessary, said a community organizer to a reporter. For too long, these investigations happened behind closed doors, if they happened at all. But within the department, the atmosphere turned toxic. The police union issued a scathing statement condemning David's actions as reckless endangerment of officers and a betrayal of those who serve. Several veteran officers submitted resignation letters, while others refused to speak to their superior except through formal channels. By afternoon, David's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Mayor Linda Williams called first, her tone measured but concerned. "I support what you're doing, David, but the council is in an uproar," she explained. "They're talking about emergency sessions, oversight committees, anything to rein you in." 3 council members demanded a private meeting where they warned him about bad optics and dangerous precedent. The most vocal among them, a former prosecutor with ties to the police union, leaned across the table. "You can't just throw your colleagues to the wolves," he hissed. "There are procedures, protocols. This isn't how things are done." David remained unmoved. "With all due respect, how things are done is exactly the problem," he replied, his voice steady. "Every name on that list has at least 5 substantiated complaints that were buried. The public deserves to know." When a state senator called, suggesting he dial back the theatrics, David simply responded, "Truth isn't theatrical, and it's not negotiable." That evening, as he drove to check on his mother, David noticed the unmarked police vehicle following him, a not-so-subtle message from those who opposed him. He wasn't naive. He knew the risks of challenging a system built on silence and protection. But each time doubt crept in, he remembered his mother's quiet dignity in that cafe, facing injustice without flinching. If Mary Johnson could stand her ground, so would her son. Through it all, Mary Johnson remained a steady presence in Atlanta's unfolding story of justice. The retired widow politely declined the dozen interview requests that flooded her mailbox each week. News vans occasionally parked outside her modest home. But reporters soon learned that Mary preferred to let her silence speak volumes, just as it had that fateful morning at Sunrise Cafe. "I'm not looking to be famous," she told her son during their Sunday dinner. David nodded, understanding his mother's desire for privacy even as her quiet dignity had sparked a movement across the city. Though Mary avoided the spotlight, her impact rippled through Atlanta. Community meetings filled beyond capacity whenever word spread she might attend. People approached her in grocery stores and church, not for autographs, but simply to thank her with respectful nods or gentle handshakes. Mary accepted these gestures with the same grace she'd shown that morning with Robert Smith. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, there was a soft knock at Mary's door. Standing on the porch was Jasmine Brown, the teenage videographer whose footage had ignited the city's conscience. The girl clutched her smartphone nervously, raindrops glistening in her braided hair. "Mrs. Johnson," Jasmine said, her voice barely audible above the rainfall. "I hope it's okay that I came by." Mary welcomed the teenager into her living room, where family photos lined the walls, including several of David in his police uniform. She prepared 2 cups of tea, while Jasmine glanced around the cozy space, seemingly surprised by its ordinary warmth. "I wanted to say thank you," Jasmine explained, carefully setting her device on the coffee table. "Before that day, I never thought anyone would listen to kids like me." Mary smiled, recognizing something of herself in the young woman's earnest expression. They sat together in comfortable silence for several minutes, the kind of silence that forms a bridge between generations. "You know," Jasmine finally whispered, leaning slightly forward, "you gave the truth a witness. When you just sat there, not yelling or crying, it made people see." Mary reached across the space between them and squeezed Jasmine's hand, her eyes shining with gratitude. No words were needed between them. Both understood the power of being seen, truly seen, perhaps for the first time. As evening approached, Jasmine rose to leave. At the doorway, Mary surprised the girl with a gentle hug. "You were brave too," Mary said softly. "Never forget that part of the story." After Jasmine departed, Mary stood watching the rain from her window, contemplating how one moment in a cafe had connected her to this fierce, hopeful generation that refused to look away from injustice, just as she had refused to look away from Robert Smith. Jasmine Brown's video had taken on a life of its own. What began as a shaky recording on a teenager's smartphone had transformed into something much more powerful, a visual testimony that resonated with thousands across Atlanta and beyond. The footage of Mary Johnson's dignified response to Officer Robert Smith's cruelty had become the cornerstone of a growing movement. "Mary Johnson isn't just one woman, she's all of us," declared a community organizer at a packed rally in Centennial Park. The crowd erupted in applause, many holding paper coffee cups raised high in solidarity. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. Local artists embraced Mary's quiet strength as inspiration. 3 massive murals appeared across Atlanta's neighborhoods, one depicting her serene face with the words, "Dignity cannot be poured away," stenciled beneath it. Another showed her sitting at the cafe window, sunlight creating a halo effect around her silhouette. The third, perhaps most striking, portrayed both Mary and Jasmine side by side, representing 2 generations united in the pursuit of justice. "I never meant to become famous," Jasmine told a local reporter, adjusting her glasses nervously. "I just couldn't watch someone be treated that way and do nothing." The teenager found herself suddenly thrust into the spotlight alongside Mary, her name becoming synonymous with youth activism and courage. School groups invited her to speak about civic responsibility, while community organizations honored her with awards. Meanwhile, Mary's mailbox overflowed daily. Letters arrived from every corner of Georgia, from elderly women who recognized their own experiences in hers, from young people inspired by her composure, from former police officers ashamed of what they'd witnessed in their careers. One particularly moving note came from a retired teacher in Savannah who wrote, "Your silence spoke volumes that shouting never could." Though she read every letter with care, the retired widow remained reluctant to step fully into the public eye. She allowed David to handle the press while she maintained her routines. Her Wednesday mornings at Sunrise Cafe, now accompanied by respectful nods from other patrons. "My mother never wanted to lead a movement," Chief Johnson explained at a community meeting. "But sometimes leadership finds you when you're simply standing in your truth." The movement continued to grow, with Mary's image appearing on T-shirts and protest signs across the city. Her few public words were quoted like scripture at vigils and community forums. What had begun as one woman's dignified response to humiliation had sparked something that reached far beyond her quiet neighborhood, a testament to how powerful a single moment of unwavering truth could be. As David Johnson dug deeper into the department's history, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Hidden beneath years of bureaucratic paperwork and sealed complaints lay a trove of misconduct cases that had been systematically buried. Among them, one name stood out: Corporal Daniel Miller. 7 years earlier, Miller had detained a 15-year-old girl named Alicia Carter outside a community center in East Atlanta. What began as questioning escalated when Alicia questioned why she was being stopped. According to the suppressed report, Miller had slammed her against a wall, handcuffed her so tightly her wrists bled, and kept her in a holding cell overnight without contacting her parents. The complaint had vanished into the system's black hole. Until now. "I recognized Officer Smith's face in that video," Alicia told David during their first meeting. Now 22, she spoke with the measured calm of someone who had carried a heavy truth for too long. The same look in his eyes, the same certainty that nothing would happen to him. When Alicia agreed to share her story publicly, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Her testimony, delivered in a 3-minute video recorded in her living room, accumulated over 2 million views in 48 hours. The young woman's quiet dignity reminded many of Mary Johnson's own composure in the face of cruelty. "After what happened to Miss Johnson, I couldn't stay silent anymore," she explained, her hands steady as she held a photograph of herself as a teenager. "If she could stand her ground with such grace, I had to find my voice too." What began as an investigation into a single officer's misconduct had transformed into something far more significant. The coffee incident had cracked open a dam, and now stories flooded through from every corner of Atlanta. A teacher described being pulled over 17 times in 1 year. A pastor recounted watching officers plant evidence on his nephew. A retired bus driver showed scars from an encounter that had never been documented. David created a dedicated hotline for testimonials, staffed by civilians rather than officers. Within 3 days, they had logged over 200 calls. "This isn't about bad apples anymore," he told his senior staff during an emergency meeting. "The entire orchard needs examination." For the first time in Atlanta's history, victims of police misconduct found themselves being actively sought out rather than silenced. The culture of fear that had kept so many quiet was beginning to crack, all because one woman had refused to lower her eyes when confronted with injustice. Alicia Carter became the face of this new chapter in the movement, her story bridging past and present in a way that made the systemic nature of the problem impossible to deny. The resistance to David Johnson's reforms intensified as the investigation gained momentum. Files documenting Robert Smith's misconduct mysteriously disappeared from the department's archives overnight. When confronted, the records clerk simply shrugged, claiming a system malfunction had corrupted several directories. 3 days later, as David prepared to present his findings to the Oversight Committee, the police headquarters experienced a sudden power outage. The backup generators, which had worked flawlessly during monthly tests, inexplicably failed. The meeting was postponed, buying the opposition precious time to organize their defense. "They think they're being clever," David told his mother over dinner that evening. Mary Johnson reached across the table and squeezed her son's hand, her eyes reflecting the same quiet strength she'd shown at Sunrise Cafe. "Truth doesn't need electricity to shine," she said softly. The most insidious attack came when doctored video clips began circulating online. The edited footage showed the police chief appearing to accept an envelope from a known drug dealer. Local news stations ran the story before verifying its authenticity, forcing David to spend valuable time defending his reputation instead of pursuing justice. Internal Affairs. Captain Ramirez, one of the few officers who supported the reforms. Trace the leak to a computer in the department's media relations office. They're fighting dirty because they're scared, she told David. That means you're winning. For every underhanded tactic employed against him, the Atlanta community rallied with greater determination. When the power went out at headquarters, over 200 residents showed up with battery-powered lanterns. When files disappeared, citizens came forward with their own documentation of encounters with problematic officers. Atlanta for Justice, a grassroots organization formed in response to the cafe incident, organized nightly candlelight vigils outside the police station. Their numbers grew from dozens to hundreds, then thousands. Participants stood in silence for 8 minutes and 15 seconds, a nod to Mary's regular Wednesday morning coffee time. Alicia Carter, who had found the courage to speak about her past experience with police brutality, became a powerful voice at these gatherings. What happened to Mary Johnson was not an isolated incident, she told the crowd. It was just the first time we refused to look away. Local artists painted murals depicting Mary's dignified face on buildings throughout the city. Beneath one particularly striking portrait, someone had written, "The quietest voice sometimes carries the furthest." Despite the department's desperate attempts to maintain the status quo, the movement for change only grew stronger. Each dirty tactic backfired, transforming potential setbacks into rallying points for a community that had finally found its voice. The battle for Atlanta's soul shifted to the marble halls of City Hall, where council members had hastily drafted a motion to create an external oversight committee with authority over the police chief's decisions. David Johnson recognized the maneuver for what it was, a bureaucratic straitjacket designed to stall his reforms and shield those who had thrived under the old system. And this committee would require the chief to obtain approval for any disciplinary action against officers with more than 5 years of service, Councilman Peterson explained with practiced neutrality. Though his connections to the police union were well documented, the packed chamber hummed with tension as David stood before the council, his calm demeanor belying the fire in his eyes. "What you're proposing isn't oversight, it's obstruction," he stated. "Every day we delay accountability. We betray the public's trust." From her seat in the front row, Mary Johnson watched her son with quiet pride. She hadn't wanted to become the face of a movement, but seeing David fight for justice filled her with a resolve that matched his own. Mayor Linda Williams entered the chamber just as the council prepared to vote. The crowd parted as she approached the podium, her tailored suit and determined stride commanding attention. She carried a thick manila folder that landed on the lectern with a decisive thud. "Before you vote," the mayor announced, "you should review these files." She opened the dossier, revealing hundreds of civilian complaints that had been systematically buried. "Chief Johnson didn't create this problem. He's the first person with the courage to address it." Linda's voice grew stronger as she continued. "I've reviewed every case in this folder. I've spoken with victims whose lives were shattered by the very people sworn to protect them." She looked directly at the council members who had proposed the motion. "If you pass this, you're choosing to be on the wrong side of history." The mayor's unwavering support shifted the atmosphere in the chamber. Community members rose to their feet in solidarity, while several council members visibly reconsidered their positions. "I was elected to serve this city," Linda declared, "not to protect a broken system. I stand with Chief Johnson and his reforms, and I invite each of you to do the same." The council chairman called for a brief recess, during which David approached the mayor. "Thank you," he said simply. Linda shook her head. "Don't thank me. This isn't about politics. It's about doing what's right." She glanced toward Mary, who acknowledged her with a grateful nod. "Your mother taught you well." As the council members huddled in corners, whispering urgently among themselves, David knew the fight was far from over, but for the first time since he'd begun this journey, he felt the tide truly turning in favor of justice. The council's attempt to silence David Johnson failed spectacularly. Mayor Linda Williams stood at the podium, her voice unwavering as cameras flashed around her. "I've reviewed every document in this dossier," she announced, holding up the thick folder of evidence. What I found was not just isolated incidents, but a pattern that demands immediate action." The press conference aired live across Atlanta, drawing record viewership. Social media exploded with clips of the mayor's impassioned defense of the police chief's reforms. "Stand With" David began trending within the hour, alongside "Justice for Mary." "My mother taught me that silence in the face of wrong is its own kind of wrong," David told reporters the following day. His expression resolute, the chief's words resonated deeply with Atlantans who had watched his mother's quiet dignity in that viral video. Outside City Hall, crowds gathered spontaneously. What began as dozens quickly swelled to hundreds, then thousands. People from every neighborhood arrived carrying handmade signs and, symbolically, coffee cups. The demonstration remained peaceful but unmistakably powerful, a visual reminder that the community would no longer accept the status quo. Alicia Carter, who had come forward with her own story of abuse, addressed the crowd through a borrowed megaphone. "Today marks the beginning of real change," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Not just promises, but action." The council, facing unprecedented public pressure, reversed course dramatically. By week's end, they unanimously approved the establishment of a civilian review board with actual authority to investigate use of force complaints. The board would include community representatives, legal experts, and former officers committed to transparency. Inside police headquarters, David assembled his command staff. "This isn't about targeting good officers," he explained. "It's about creating a department worthy of the community's trust." Some nodded in agreement, others stared at the floor, uncomfortable with the pace of change. The department's protocols underwent immediate revision. De-escalation training became mandatory. Body cameras could no longer be deactivated during civilian interactions. Anonymous reporting systems were implemented to break the code of silence that had protected officers like Robert Smith for years. Local businesses joined the movement. The owner of Sunrise Cafe, where everything had begun, announced that Mary would never pay for coffee again. A local tech company donated equipment to ensure body camera footage would be properly stored and accessible. As the sun set on that pivotal week, David visited his mother. Mary sat quietly in her living room, watching the news coverage with a mixture of pride and disbelief. "I never wanted any of this attention," she said softly. "I know, Mom," David replied, taking her hand. But sometimes, the quietest voice causes the loudest change." 6 months after the incident at Sunrise Cafe, the Atlanta Police Department had transformed in ways few could have imagined. The headquarters, once a fortress of secrecy, now featured glass-walled meeting rooms and public information boards detailing departmental policies and complaint procedures. Officers attended mandatory de-escalation trainings 3 times monthly, wearing body cameras that couldn't be deactivated during civilian interactions. Chief David Johnson had implemented a zero-tolerance policy for misconduct cover-ups. The new Civilian Review Board met weekly, reviewing footage and interviewing witnesses with unprecedented transparency. What had once been whispered in break rooms was now discussed openly in community forums. The culture of silence was giving way to accountability. "I barely recognize the place," remarked a veteran sergeant to the local newspaper, "but I sleep better at night, knowing we're doing the job right." Mary Johnson, who had once been known simply as a quiet widow who kept to herself, found her routine permanently altered. At the monthly community council meetings, residents would stand when she entered the room, not out of protocol but genuine respect. Her beige cardigan and simple pearl earrings had become as recognizable as any uniform in Atlanta. "Mrs. Johnson, would you mind saying a few words?" the community coordinator asked at the East Atlanta gathering. Mary smiled softly, but shook her head. Her power had never come from speeches. The retired widow preferred listening, nodding encouragingly as younger activists outlined their proposals for community policing initiatives. After meetings, people would approach her carefully, often just to squeeze her hand or thank her. Some shared their own stories of encounters with Robert Smith or other officers who had since been removed from duty. Mary listened to each one, her eyes reflecting both their pain and their hope. "You didn't have to shout to be heard," Alicia Carter told her one evening. The young woman who had come forward about her own experience with police brutality now volunteered with the Civilian Review Board. "You taught us all that dignity speaks louder than rage." On her way home, Mary often passed a mural painted on the side of a community center, her silhouette sitting calmly at a cafe table, surrounded by coffee cups that transformed into doves as they rose toward the sky. The artist had captured something essential about her quiet strength. Back in her modest home, surrounded by letters from strangers and newspaper clippings her neighbors kept bringing by, Mary would sometimes feel overwhelmed by the attention, but when she called her son David, his voice steady with purpose as he described the day's reforms, she knew their shared sacrifice had been worthwhile. Mary Johnson stared at her reflection in the window of her living room, watching as the early morning light painted the Atlanta skyline in gentle hues of amber and gold. 6 months ago, she had been just another retired widow enjoying her quiet routines. Now, her face appeared on murals across the city, her story discussed in community centers and church basements. "Mrs. Johnson, would you sign this?" A young woman had approached her at the grocery store yesterday, holding out a printout of an article about the movement. The 7th such request that week. Mary had smiled and obliged, her hand slightly trembling as she wrote her name. The weight of becoming a symbol pressed heavily on her shoulders. She missed the anonymity of her Wednesday mornings at Sunrise Cafe, where she could simply be herself rather than Mary Johnson, the woman whose dignity had sparked a revolution. Her home, once a sanctuary, now regularly received letters from strangers sharing their own stories of injustice and hope. "I never asked for any of this," she whispered to herself, running her fingers along the edge of her favorite armchair. The retired widow had always preferred the background, finding comfort in routine and solitude. Now, community organizers called weekly, inviting her to speak at rallies and meetings. Yet whenever doubt crept in, Mary thought of her son. David had risked everything, his career, his reputation, even his safety, to stand for what was right. She remembered his voice, steady and determined, as he addressed the police department that first difficult week. "We will be the change this city deserves." She thought, too, of Jasmine Brown, the brave teenager who had captured that fateful moment on her smartphone. The girl had visited last Sunday, bringing homemade cookies and sitting quietly beside Mary on the porch. "You know," Jasmine had said, "my little sister wants to be a police officer now, a good one, like your son." It was moments like these that steadied Mary when the attention became overwhelming. Each letter that arrived, each stranger who approached her with tears in their eyes, they were reminders that her quiet dignity had given voice to something much larger than herself. Mary picked up her cup of tea and took a slow sip. Perhaps this was never about her at all. Perhaps she had simply been the mirror that allowed Atlanta to finally see itself clearly. And if her discomfort was the price for that awakening, she would pay it gladly. She smiled softly. Her voice, never loud but always true, had carried further than she ever could have imagined. 1 year had passed since that fateful morning at Sunrise Cafe. The anniversary arrived with little fanfare, but its significance resonated throughout Atlanta. David Johnson sat at his desk late into the evening, carefully crafting an open letter to the city that had both challenged and embraced him during the most turbulent year of his career. "To the people of Atlanta," he wrote, his fingers moving deliberately across the keyboard. "1 year ago, we began a journey together, not by choice, but by necessity. We have dismantled systems that protected the wrong people. We have built new ones that serve everyone. "We are not perfect," he continued, "but we are not afraid to change." The police chief published the letter at midnight, thanking the community for standing with his family through the darkest days. By morning, it had been shared thousands of times, with comments flooding in from citizens expressing gratitude for his unwavering commitment to reform. At the renovated Sunrise Cafe, Mary Johnson claimed her usual spot by the window. The owner had reserved this table permanently for her. A small brass plaque now marked it as Mary's Corner. She wrapped her hands around her mug, the warmth seeping into her fingers as she gazed out at the street. A young officer, one of the new recruits who had joined after the department's overhaul, nodded respectfully as he passed by on his morning patrol. Mary returned the gesture with a gentle smile. These small acknowledgments no longer surprised her, though she never sought recognition. "More coffee, Ms. Johnson?" asked the server, a college student who had attended every rally last summer. "Thank you, dear," Mary replied, her voice soft but no longer timid. Across town, Mayor Linda Williams was announcing the expansion of the Civilian Oversight Board, a program that had already shown remarkable success in rebuilding community trust. In her speech, she quoted Mary without naming her. "Dignity speaks louder than words." Jasmine Brown, now studying journalism at Atlanta University, had turned her viral video into the foundation of a documentary about community policing. She had interviewed Mary just last week, capturing the quiet wisdom that had become legendary throughout the city. As Mary sipped her coffee, she watched the morning unfold outside. Neighbors greeted each other with more openness. Officers walked their beats with humility rather than swagger. The city moved with a different rhythm, stronger, braver, and finally ready to listen to voices like hers. She set down her cup and smiled softly. The ripples from that single moment of defiance had transformed into waves of change. Mary had never wanted to be a symbol, but she had come to accept that sometimes silence, when witnessed, could speak volumes.